Парад!
Russian propaganda keeps on yelling about fascists and Nazis in Ukraine, with a multitude of intonations, with faint brotherly amazement.
Ну не может же быть, что наш народ, наш, который вместе с нами воевал с нацизмом, и вдруг у них так много их стало. Пожалуйста, пожалуйста. Да. Ну это как минимум десятки тысяч людей.
With thundering accusations.
То есть это фашистский режим, это фашистские бандформирования, и это фашистские вооруженные силы.
All with conspiratorial exaltation.
Конкретные шаги мы наблюдаем сегодня по возрождению глобального нацистского проекта. А почему глобальный проект? Я сказала, глобальный нацистский проект. Потому что Украина – это место, откуда начинается вот это возрождение.
Russian propaganda accuses those who support Ukraine of fascism and Nazism as well. For example, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki.
Тем временем фашистский террор набирает обороты уже не только на Украине, но и в Европе. Премьер-министр Польши Моrawiecki заявил, что русский мир представляет собой угрозу для всей Европы. Более того, Morawiecki призвал полностью уничтожить эту чудовищную идеологию.
Or even German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Я думаю, а чё он полез-то? А он кумиром своим полез. Я сразу вспомнил эту фотографию. Вот же как все было. Вот, покажите, покажите. О! Рядом поставьте вторую фотографию, чтобы было ясно. Вот куда лет Шольц, чтобы подобиться своему кумиру с усиками.
Even Putin's stated goals for the war against Ukraine directly refer to the fight against Nazism.
Мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Stories about Ukrainian fascists and Nazis, the terms are used interchangeably, once in Soviet and now in Russian propaganda, are the ammo for all the Russian information weapons, from the official speeches of Russian leadership and state-run media to herds of Kremlin bots on social networks. An unprepared viewer or reader may think that all this is a unique phenomenon concerning only Ukraine and only today. It is not the case. It's an old Kremlin playbook that for decades has been bringing Russians to the story of the victory over fascism and Nazism in World War II. In this video, we'll show you fragments of all documentaries and reports, quote Soviet newspapers, talk to experts, to prove that as soon as there is a need to designate someone an enemy and to vilify them, or to justify a military intervention, the Kremlin puts on the good old broken record about fascism and Nazism. And the messages of the Kremlin's propaganda have not changed for decades. We'll also try to understand how it happened that this old stale propaganda led to a very real genocide in Ukraine in 2022. In fact, branding enemies of the USSR regime as fascists began even before World War II. Stalin's Great Terror was partly perpetrated under the pretext of fighting fascists. However, this propaganda became completely consistent after the victory against Hitler. From then on, it has combined references to absolute evil with nostalgia for the moment of the Soviet Union's greatest glory. Already in the Korean War of the 1950s, the Soviet Union had to fight the fascists again, if we are to believe the Soviet newspapers. Although the USSR did not officially participate in this war, Soviet aircraft, troops and weapons were very much present on the North Korean side, and so were the Soviet media. One of the main Soviet culture and political newspapers, Lithuania Gazeta, routinely portrayed the Americans who fought on the South Korean side as American SS, or even more artfully, the present-day stewards of Hitler on Earth.
The shameful failure of the Americans in Korea is not just a military failure, it is the defeat of the fascist imperialist doctrine.
But the propaganda about fascists really thrived whenever the Kremlin officially sent troops somewhere, for example to Hungary in 1956. Soviet tanks smothered the Hungarian anti-Soviet revolution to the loud accompaniment of propaganda. For example, in just one brief article on November 10, 1956, the same Lithuania Gazeta called the Hungarian revolutionaries fascists 4 times, wrote that their massacres were similar to orgies of Hitler's SS, and that they carried out mass murders in lines with Gestapo recipes. To justify its intervention in Hungary, Moscow released a documentary film in Budapest in the same year. The 14 minutes of the film are packed full of narratives about fascism. Like this.
Страшный призрак фашистского зверя поднялся над всей Венгрией. Надо было спасти судьбу страны.
And like this.
На законные действия масс попытались использовать фашистские элементы.
And also like this.
Пользуясь слабостью и двойственной политикой правительства Имре Надя, фашисты бесчинствовали.
And like this.
По всему городу рыскали шайки фашистов.
In short, if we don't look at the pictures, we might think that this is Russian propaganda of 2022 about Ukraine.
Наши ребята там разят гадину фашистскую. Это правильно, но это правильно все. Да дайте мне договорить. Да. Это триумф русского оружия, это триумф русской армии, это возрождение России.
Just like in 2022, in the 1956 movie about Budapest, the narrative about fascists is accompanied by the narrative about the conniving West. After all, the fascists did not just arise by themselves in Hungary, they were organized by Western imperialists.
Откуда же взялось оружие, которого оказалось так много в руках у фашистов? Из-за рубежа.
Of course, the Soviet documentary revealed a global conspiracy and explained that the Americans were behind the Hungarian Revolution.
Недаром один из участников путча сказал корреспонденту Daily News: «Сильная, большая Америка толкнула нас на это».
So, in 1956, Soviet tanks did not crush freedom in Hungary, but fascism, if we are to believe the Kremlin propaganda. The exact same thing happened again in 1968, when Soviet tanks rolled in to choke freedom in Prague. In 1968, the Lithuania Gazeta didn't stand aside either. In its issue of August 28th, it spoke about former Hitler's generals, SS officers, and fascist politicians in the club K231, an organization of former political prisoners of the Czechoslovak communist regime, convicted under the oppressive law 231 of 1948. This club became one of the driving forces of the Prague Spring and a target for Soviet propaganda attacks. The propaganda was disseminated in Czechoslovakia as well.
Takovýhle materiál to vyšlo v Pravdě 22. srpna 1968. Obrana socialismu nejvyšší internacionální povinnost. A tenhle ten materiál byl přeložen a používán a šířen. To znamená, ta brožura byla rozhazována prostě těmi okupačními vojsky jako z vrtulníků anebo z aut a tak dále.
This translated article from the Soviet newspaper Pravda also referred to the fascists in the K231. The 1969 Soviet propaganda documentary Czechoslovakia, A Year of Trials told the same story, with corresponding visuals.
В клубе можно было встретить наиболее махровых реакционеров, многих, кто сотрудничал с гитлеровцами в годы оккупации. Представляете, как относились эти предатели к народной власти?
Those who hadn't collaborated with the Hitlerites still could, the film explained, also with the necessary visuals. Here is a quote about one of the Czech opposition figures.
А 30 лет назад нацисты в Судетах его на руках выносили. И не только Гейн Лейн, но, простите, сам автор Мюнхенского договора мог бы приветствовать такого чеха.
Both this film and Soviet newspapers also copiously reminded that a quarter of a century ago, Czechs and Slovaks, together with the USSR, resisted the Nazis. This had a purpose too.
Tam se argumentovalo osvobození Československa a oběťmi, které přinesl Sovětský svaz, to znamená těch 140 000 mrtvých, jako při osvobozování celého Československa, nejenom Prahy, že jo, ale jako je to od Slovenska až tady. Takže tam bylo, v podstatě se tam apelovalo, my jsme vám pomohli, my jsme prostě prolili tady krev, to znamená, vy jste nám povinni v podstatě jako s námi být solidární přátelé, v uvozovkách.
Although Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Ukraine in 2022 were in completely different geopolitical situations, the geopolitical reasoning for Moscow's invasion of Prague in Soviet propaganda was very similar.
Географическое положение Чехословакии может превратить ее как в засов Варшавского пакта, так и в брешь, открывающую всю военную систему Восточного блока. Потом в Соединенных Штатах в ноябре, журнал Fortune, профессор Герман Кан подтвердит, ослабление Варшавского пакта и усиление Западной Германии могло бы завершиться при поддержке США нападением Западной Германии на СССР.
So, if we hadn't come to Prague on tanks, the tanks would have come to us through Prague. Absolute correlation with the Russian claims about Ukraine in 2022.
На прилегающих к нам территориях, замечу, на наших же исторических территориях, создается враждебная нам антироссия, которая поставлена под полный внешний контроль, усиленно обживается вооруженными силами натовских стран и накачивается самым современным оружием.
The propaganda about 1968 proved to be surprisingly enduring, even after Czechoslovakia left the socialist bloc and the Soviet Union collapsed.
Vysvětlení, že šlo o tu pomoc v roce 68, v podstatě, jak se ukazuje, a je to doloženo i řadou svědectví, že ta v tom povědomí, té paměti obyvatel Sovětského svazu, respektive, že zůstala.
This applies not only to the socialist assistance to the Czechoslovak workers, it also applies to the propaganda about fascism. In 2015, the Russian state TV channel Russia 1 aired a new documentary, Warsaw Pact Declassified Pages. Not only did it use footage from the old 1969 documentary, it also repeated, in a fresher way, the allegations about fascists in K231.
Там было много людей, которые ранее были судимы по статье 231 Конституционного закона о защите республики. По этой статье было осуждено много бывших фашистов, эсэсовцев, пособников Гитлеру.
The film even messes up the origin of the name K231 Club. Instead of the number of the law, they refer to some article. Accuracy isn't important. It's only important that the viewer feels the threat even after decades.
Сегодня эту организацию многие пытаются представить как всего лишь одну из оппозиционных партий. Но на деле члены клуба 231 больше походили на боевиков-наемников.
Of course, all this was nothing more than a word-for-word reiteration of Soviet propaganda clichés. However, it caused outrage in the Czech Republic. Even President Miloš Zeman, at the time known for his openly pro-Russian stances, said, "This film is a journalistic lie of Russian television." Soviet propaganda continued to justify the Kremlin's military interventions by fighting fascists and Nazis until the very collapse of the USSR. A great example of such propaganda from 1991 are the reports from Lithuania and Latvia by Alexander Nevzorov, now a so-called good Russian who had recently obtained Ukrainian citizenship. In the very beginning of 1991, the Kremlin made its last frantic attempts to prevent the Baltic states from leaving the Soviet Union. To this end, paratroopers were sent to Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. In Riga, the capital of Latvia, the Soviet Union was defended by Oman, Moscow's special police force. In Alexander Nevzorov's report, the head of the Riga Oman explained what it was that he was fighting for.
С кем вы боретесь? И за что вы боретесь?
Мы боремся с фашизмом, который все больше и больше процветает на территории Латвийской ССР.
Not only the head of the special police force, but also Nevzorov himself mentions fascism in Latvia in the report. Here, for example.
От слова ОМОН трясет народные фронты и подпольные, полуподпольные и явные националистические фашистские организации, типа Департамента охраны или местного МВД.
Nevzorov's reports not only reveal the unchanging nature of the fight against fascism narrative that stigmatized any aspirations for independence from Moscow. be it in 56 in Budapest, 68 in Prague, or 91 in Latvia and Lithuania. They also allow us to observe an interesting transformation. Moscow justified the 56 and 68 interventions by a need to protect socialism and workers. That was at a time when Moscow was the capital of socialism and proletariat. With the collapse of the USSR, Moscow became the capital of Russia, and the object of its so-called protection changed accordingly. Now it is mostly Russians and Russian speakers. Cries about the oppression of Russians and the rights of the Russian-speaking population would become particularly characteristic of Russian propaganda during the Russian-Georgian and Russian-Ukrainian wars, but as early as 1991 they were already featured in Nevzorov's reports. For instance,
С ними несколько сотен дружинников, полномочных представителей тех сотен тысяч русскоязычного населения, что не имеют уже в Литве ни голоса, ни права, ни говорить, ни защищаться. Стоят десантники. И они-то действительно хорошо знают, что уходить им нельзя.
The Russian-speaking population of Vilnius also recounted horrors like this.
И вот спасибо вот этим ребятам. Если бы не они, то бы, наверное, уже у нас бы это горло было подрезано. Это я вам даю гарантию. То, что вчера женщина подошла от Верховного Совета и плачет. Там, говорит, заявляют, что мы, говорит, русских будем резать. Все русскоязычное население. Вот такие заявления лидеров Союза.
This is remarkably reminiscent of the things that Russian propaganda used to support Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. It was all about protecting Russian speakers.
Мы вынуждены, я хочу подчеркнуть, вынуждены были защищать и русскоязычное население на Донбассе.
It was the necessity to protect the rights of Russian speakers and Russian citizens in South Ossetia that Russia used to justify its invasion of Georgia in 2008. Russia prepared for the invasion of Georgia in 2008 by actively distributing Russian passports in South Ossetia. Then it came to protect its own people.
Сейчас в Южной Осетии гибнут мирные люди, женщины, дети, старики, и большинство из них – это граждане Российской Федерации. Как президент Российской Федерации я обязан защищать жизнь и достоинство российских граждан, где бы они ни находились.
That's a classic of the imperial look into the sphere of influence. So wherever sort of my people are, I'm almost there, and then I have the right and responsibility to defend them.
The narrative about the alleged genocide in South Ossetia was a fusion of two narratives, the new one about the oppression of the Russian or Russian-speaking population and the traditional one about the fascists and Nazis. Accusations of genocide were voiced by the Russian media. During the war, the Russia Today channel was broadcasting with a large caption saying genocide. The same accusation was made by the then former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev.
Народ Южной Осетии пережил геноцид. И так и нужно об этом говорить.
Ekat Keshilashvili, who in 2008 first served as the Prosecutor General and then as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, believes that the talk of genocide had two goals. First, to create a formal legal pretext for war, an ostensible obligation to stop genocide.
They try to mimic in an ironic way what the West might have done in other situations for humanitarian action, for use of force, extraterritorial use of force for stopping the bloodshed or the armed conflicts. So they want to they switch the table, so to say, in this case, and then they have to have from formal point of view arguments that could look as justified.
The second goal was purely propaganda, to repeat the old Soviet narrative about the fight against fascism.
All these claims about genocide are more formalistic from legal point of view on what it is that they do, maintaining symbolism as if they are once again the guys who are fighting Nazism in Europe, as it was the case in the Second World War. And by that, maintaining that continuity of its link with the Soviet Union.
Shortly after Georgia, Russia turned the accusations of genocide of the Russian-speaking population to Ukraine. For 8 years, since 2014, Russians have been shelling the media with propaganda about genocide in Donbas. The Russian leadership was actively involved in this right up until February 24th. Here's, for example, Vladimir Putin at a briefing after a meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz only 9 days before the full-scale invasion.
По нашим оценкам, то, что происходит на Донбассе сегодня, это и есть геноцид.
Finally, in his February 24th speech, the de facto declaration of war, it was with genocide that Putin once again explained the need for an invasion.
Необходимо было немедленно прекратить этот кошмар. Геноцид в отношении проживающих там миллионов людей, которые надеются только на Россию.
Of course, in that speech, Putin also used the narrative about fascists and Nazis who must be stopped. For example, in the part where he addressed the Ukrainian military.
Ваши отцы, деды и прадеды не для того сражались с нацистами, защищая нашу общую родину, чтобы сегодняшние неонацисты захватили власть на Украине.
The artificial nature of the latest round of Kremlin's propaganda about the fight against fascism in support of its latest military intervention is confirmed by hard data. According to the analytical company Semantic Visions, on February 24th, there was a major spike in references to Nazism in Ukraine in Russian media, although the number was fairly insignificant before that. But in all, it is not the first time that Russia accuses Ukraine of fascism, Nazism, or radical nationalism. In fact, not a single major Russian information operation against Ukraine could do without it. The first such information war against independent Ukraine happened in the early 1990s, when Russia and the United States simultaneously forced Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal as quickly as possible. At that time, Ukraine's negotiating group on nuclear disarmament was headed by Yuri Kostenko.
Такий посил, яким Росія постійно спекулювала, це те, що українці – це свого роду дикуни з ядерною булавою. Вони абсолютно не знаються на ядерних технологіях. В них був Чорнобиль, вони ще один Чорнобиль, бачите, хочуть. І лякали тим, що ядерні боєзаряди завершується в них термін гарантійний, а відтак вони стають надзвичайно небезпечними для всього світу.
Russians also accused Ukrainians of radical nationalism. This message was spread more in political and diplomatic circles than in the media. In his book, The History of Ukraine's Nuclear Disarmament, Yuri Kostenko recalls his conversation with former US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski at that time. Among other things, Mr. Brzezinski gave a warning.
The West sees nuclear weapons as a hazard. It fears the possibility of the nuclear war. Russia endeavored to create the image of Ukraine as a radical nationalist state.
Мене називали мій візаві по переговорам посол Дубінін, який очолював російську делегацію, один із лідерів націоналістичного руху. Це так він, значить, в своїх спогадах про переговорний процес із Україною, що я очолював тоді урядову делегацію. Звичайно, що тема націоналізм, ну тоді ще фашизму, як зараз, вони не приписували, але націоналізмом лякали всю Європу, лякали Сполучені Штати Америки. І це ще відбувалося навіть до проголошення незалежності. Згадайте приїзд Буша старшого в 91-му році, здається, 30 липня він виступав у нас в парламенті і лякав вбивчим націоналізмом, який Штати не приймають і відкидають.
Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred.
There are well-founded assumptions that this phrase in the US president's speech emerged under the influence of his conversations with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that they had shortly before.
Якщо просто вслухатись у термін «суїцидальний націоналізм», стає очевидно, що це вираз із Кремля. А вони ж постійно говорили про такі речі, як наближення громадянської війни, про фашизм, антисемітизм.
The Kremlin has been accusing Ukrainians of fascism long before Ukrainian independence, especially when it came to studying and publicizing not an imaginary, but a quite real genocide, Stalin's Holodomor, the Great Famine, in Ukraine of 1932-1933. Raphael Lemkin, the very inventor of the term genocide, called this artificial famine, which killed millions of Ukrainians, a classic Soviet genocide. This topic was, of course, banned in the USSR, and even decades later, the Kremlin branded anyone who studied or discussed it as a fascist. It began right at the time of the Holodomor. Back then, Hitler's Germany was perhaps the only country in Western Europe that was actively discussing the Great Famine in the USSR.
Восени 1933 року навіть була організована виставка голодних листів. Це були абсолютно правдиві листі. І навіть оці взірці цього так званого хліба, тобто оцю полову, яку люди там вживали в їжу, це все також доправлялося до рідних, до близьких, до знайомих. І от була організована така виставка. І от тоді на офіційному рівні Совєтський Союз зробив заяву про те, що це є брехня.
When Nazi Germany occupied Ukraine during World War II, they allowed to study the Holodomor and publish articles about it. The occupiers even encouraged it. Naturally, as with the 1933 exhibition, this was not for humanistic reasons. The Germans pursued their own political goals. The truth about the Holodomor was simply convenient for them.
Драма України і українців полягала в тому, що з одного боку з'явилися можливості про це писати і говорити, але з іншого боку, в умовах окупації нацистська влада допускала це лише тому, що це вписувалося в контекст антикомуністичної пропаганди і для легітимації власного правління.
This historical tragedy became the foundation of the Soviet notion that those who talk of Holodomor are fascists and Nazis. Anne Applebaum described it in her book Red Famine. Critics of the USSR were no longer mere enemies but fascists or Nazis. Any talk of the famine was Hitlerite propaganda. This propaganda became especially intense in the 1980s in response to the study of the Holodomor by Harvard scholars and a US Congressional Commission. The mantra about the Nazis was a part of the KGB methodology of that time.
Будь-хто, хто піднімає цю тему, педелювати на тому, що вони піднімають цю тему, тому що вони нацистські нащадки, або вони самі нацистські злочинці, або вони нащадки нацистських злочинців.
This message of Soviet propaganda was primarily intended to be exported to the West to discredit Holodomor researchers. A striking example of this was the book Fraud, Famine and Fascism, The Ukrainian Genocide Myth from Hitler to Harvard by a Canadian leftist activist Douglas Tardle, which was published in 1987. That this book is a Kremlin creation is evident not just from its repetition of Soviet propaganda talking points.
У нас тут в Києві, в архіві, Центральний архів громадських організацій України, є документи, які вказують на те, що під час написання цієї книжки з Москви надходили розпорядження в Україну, і тут українські науковці, які там працювали, підпрацьовували на цю книжку, тобто опрацьовувались тут якісь концептуальні речі і так далі, тому подібне.
Ludmila Hrinevich underlines that the combination of the Holodomor and Nazism is still alive in Russian propaganda, and Putin's denazification for Ukraine also means the eradication of the history of the Holodomor as genocide of the Ukrainian people. So the Kremlin has been droning on about fascism and Nazism whenever Moscow sees fit. But the peculiarity of Russian propaganda in 2022 about fascism in Ukraine or the alleged genocide of the population of Donbas is that it led to real genocide. This is the conclusion of an international group of experts led by Professor Azim Ibrahim. In May this year, the group published a big report on Russian acts of genocide in Ukraine under the auspices of New Lines Institute and Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. In this report, Russian propaganda is explicitly described as incitement to genocide.
So we had teams of experts going through some of this material, linguistical experts, going through the Russian telegram channels from the highest levels of the Duma, the National Security Council of the Kremlin, etc., to interpret what they were saying. And it was very clear that the foundations of genocidal action are being laid with this propaganda.
The report identifies two important elements of this propaganda: accusations of Ukrainians of Nazism and fascism, as well as the alleged genocide in Donbas. The authors of the report refer to this feature of Russian genocidal propaganda as accusations in a mirror.
Accusations in a mirror is another genocidal tactic, is when you accuse the victims of action that you yourself are planning to undertake. So you say, these are Nazis, the Ukrainian Nazis, they are about to attack us, and if we don't attack them, then they will attack us first.
Propaganda paints a picture of an existential threat to Russians and calls for the destruction of the threat. One of the most striking examples is Timofey Segeitsev's article "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine," which Professor Timothy Snyder called one of the most openly genocidal documents he had ever seen. In addition to the top, a significant portion of the masses who are passive Nazis, accomplices of Nazism, are also guilty. They supported the Nazi government and indulged it. Fair punishment of this part of the population is possible only as bearing the inevitable hardships of a just war against the Nazi system. Ukrainian means Nazi, which means it must be destroyed. This was one of the main messages of Russian propaganda during the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2022.
Итого мы получим максимум 5% неизлечимых. В простом выражении 2 миллиона человек. Вот эти вот 2 миллиона человек должны были либо уехать с Украины, либо должны быть денацифицированы. То есть быть уничтожены. Не больше.
Of course, this begs the question: if the Kremlin's propaganda about Nazis and fascists led to genocide of Ukrainians in 2022, why did the same narratives not lead to genocide in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and in other cases? There are several possible reasons. One of them is the unprecedented scale and aggressiveness of modern propaganda. The second is that, unlike in 1956 and 1968, Moscow's invasion did not go smoothly as planned and was met with valiant resistance from Ukrainians. That is when the hatred that the invaders were pumped with by the propaganda overflowed.
So things essentially did not go to Moscow's plan, hence why they started upping the ante in terms of genocidal action, mass murder, mass graves, and much of it is out of frustration.
The Soviet-Russian paranoid myth about fascists everywhere looked just absurd for quite a long time. Until recently, while watching the Soviet documentaries about Budapest 56 or Prague 68 or Nevzorov's 91 reports, you could just make the cuckoo sign and dismiss it. But 2022 revealed the terrible lethality of this broken propaganda record. This is not just a jumble of lies. This is a jumble of hatred. This is a narrative about Nazism and fascism which generates Nazism and fascism, a narrative about genocide which causes genocide. The place for it then isn't in the department of opinions and freedom of speech or in that of historical curiosities, but in the department of evidence of the greatest crime of all, the crime of genocide.